He was the strongest. That is what everyone feared. But strength is not the same as toughness. Randy Savage understood this better than anyone. He lived in a world where men lied for a living. They played tough. They acted dangerous. But Savage could see through the act. He spent his entire career searching for the real thing. He needed to know who could actually hurt him, who could protect him, who could survive him, and who could outlast him. This is the story of 5 men who passed his test. But this is not a celebration. This is a confession. Randy Savage picked these names because he was paranoid. He was controlling. He was exhausting to be around. And these 5 men were the proof of everything wrong with him. Savage once told an interviewer that there are no tough guys in wrestling. That was a lie. His whole life was built around tough guys. He carried weapons. He checked his car for bombs. He locked his wife in dressing rooms. He trusted nobody. The golden era of wrestling was not a cartoon. It was a carnival mirror world where fiction and reality bled together. Kayfabe was not just a trick for the audience. It became the air the wrestlers breathed. Savage breathed it deeper than anyone. He was a method actor trapped in high-stakes improvisation. His perfectionism was legendary. His paranoia was worse. And his competitive drive meant he could never relax. Not for 1 second. If you understand how intense that feels, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because what comes next gets darker. Savage divided toughness into 3 categories. Lethal toughness meant men who could end you in a real fight. Functional toughness meant men who combined strength with a willingness to use violence. Systemic toughness meant men who could push the limits of the body or the mind. Haku and Harley Race were lethal. Rick Rude was functional. Ricky Steamboat was the ultimate athlete. Hulk Hogan was the political animal who broke spirits instead of bones. Savage did not respect these men because he was noble. He respected them because he needed them. He needed protection. He needed validation. He needed a mountain to climb. And most of all, he needed to feel like he was not alone in his paranoia. These 5 names were not just tough. They were the mirrors that showed Savage who he really was. And what they reflected was not pretty. The wrestling business in the late 20th century was a Darwinian ecosystem. It was survival of the fittest in every possible sense. Physical survival meant enduring brutal travel schedules. Mental survival meant navigating cutthroat backstage politics. Emotional survival meant keeping your sanity in a world where your character became your identity. And Savage struggled with all 3. He was brilliant in the ring. His matches were works of art. But outside the ring, he was a mess. He suspected everyone. He questioned everything. He saw threats where none existed. And he built walls around himself that almost nobody could penetrate. The 5 men on his list were not the men he loved. They were the men he feared, needed, or could not escape. Understanding Savage requires understanding his father. Angelo Pofa was a wrestler himself. He raised Randy in the business, and he instilled in him a deep distrust of the industry. Angelo believed the business was full of sharks. He believed everyone was out to take what was yours. He believed you had to fight for every inch. And Randy absorbed that worldview completely. It shaped everything about him. His paranoia was not irrational. It was learned. It was passed down like a family heirloom. And it made Randy Savage one of the most difficult men to work with in wrestling history. But it also made him one of the best, because he never coasted. He never trusted anyone to carry him. He worked harder than everyone else because he believed he had to. And that work ethic created magic, but it also created misery. Number 5 on the list is Haku. His real name was Tonga Fifita. In the WWF, he was Haku. In WCW, he was Meng. The name did not matter. The fear was the same. Lanny Poffo was Savage's brother. He knew Randy better than anyone, and Lanny said it plainly. Randy did not want any part of Haku. That is a remarkable admission. Savage was involved in backstage fights. He carried weapons. He was not afraid to throw hands. But with Haku, he drew a line. He would not test him. He would not provoke him. He would not even joke near him because Haku was not performing. Everyone else in wrestling crafted an image. They wore leather. They cut promos. They flexed. Haku just existed, and that existence was terrifying. Savage told his brother something even more revealing. He said Haku was the only one who did not know he was the toughest guy in the world. Think about what that means. Savage believed Haku's danger was innate. It was not something he worked on. It was not something he showed off. It just was. And because Haku did not need to prove anything, any violence he inflicted would be efficient. It would be devastating. It would not be for show. It would be to end you. That is what Savage feared. Not the performance of toughness, the truth of it. Haku did not talk about being tough. He did not brag about bar fights. He did not tell stories to build his reputation. His reputation built itself, and that made him more dangerous than anyone who actively tried to seem dangerous. The locker room culture of the 80s was built on ribbing, pranks, hazing, testing each other. It was how wrestlers established the pecking order. Veterans would rib rookies to see if they could take it. Equals would rib each other to bond or to test boundaries. It was part of the culture. But Haku was exempt. Nobody would pull a rib on Haku. Lanny confirmed this. Everybody was scared of him. For Savage, this created a strange kind of safety. If you stayed on Haku's good side, his presence acted as a shield. Nobody dared provoke him, and by extension, nobody dared provoke the people near him. Savage was paranoid about being targeted. He felt like the office was out to get him. He felt like other wrestlers resented him. But Haku was a zone of stability, a no-rib zone, and Savage clung to that. The absence of stories is sometimes more telling than their presence. There are countless stories of wrestlers ribbing each other. Andre the Giant ribbing new guys. Ric Flair ribbing the young boys. The Undertaker maintaining locker room discipline through strategic ribs. But there are no stories of anyone ribbing Haku. Zero. That silence is deafening. It tells you everything you need to know. The toughest guys in the business, men who feared nothing, feared Haku. And Savage knew it. He saw it every day. And it shaped how he moved through the world. He knew that if Haku was in the building, nobody was starting trouble. And that gave Savage a rare moment of peace in an otherwise chaotic existence. When Savage moved to WCW in the mid-90s, Haku was there too. Now he was called Monk. The dynamic did not change. Savage still did not want any part of him. This continuity matters. Wrestling is an industry of shifting reputations. New tough guys come in, MMA fighters, football players, street fighters, and often the old guard gets dismissed. The younger generation thinks the old stories are exaggerated, but Haku's reputation stayed pristine across 2 decades in 2 companies. That validates everything Savage believed. Haku was the universal constant of toughness, and Savage's respect for him was not admiration, it was survival instinct. He respected Haku the way you respect a loaded gun. You do not mess with it. You just make sure it is not pointed at you. There were other tough guys in the locker room. The Barbarian was another island guy who had a reputation. Bad News Brown was a legitimate judo expert who once challenged Andre the Giant. Brock Lesnar would come later and bring MMA credibility. But none of them occupied the same space in Savage's mind as Haku, because Haku represented something primal. He was not tough because he trained. He was not tough because he studied martial arts. He was tough because something inside him was wired differently. He felt less pain. He feared less danger. He had less restraint. And that combination made him the most dangerous man in the business. Savage knew that, and it haunted him, because Savage was always calculating, always planning, always trying to stay 3 steps ahead. But with Haku, there were no steps. There was just the reality that if things went wrong, Savage could not win. And for a control freak like Savage, that was unbearable. But Savage did not only fear the quiet killer, he also hired a man for trouble. Number 4 is Rick Rude. If Haku was the nuclear option, Rude was the tactical strike force. Rude was a former bouncer. He had knockout power in one punch. His grip strength was legendary, and Savage kept him close. Not as a friend, as an enforcer. Rude was the man Savage brought to places where violence might happen. And in Savage's world, that was everywhere. The most famous example of this is the Waffle House incident. It happened in Nashville. Savage, Rude, and possibly the Dynamite Kid were eating. Savage became agitated. Maybe someone intruded on his space. Maybe the staff said something. Maybe someone recognized him and would not leave him alone. It does not matter what the trigger was. What matters is what happened next. The situation escalated into a brawl. Savage felt comfortable escalating because Rude was there. Rude did not take rubbish from anyone. He could legit knock guys out. And that gave Savage the confidence to push things further than he should have. This was a pattern with Savage. When he felt safe, he became more aggressive. When he felt vulnerable, he withdrew. Rude made him feel safe, so Savage pushed buttons. He escalated conflicts. He turned minor annoyances into major confrontations because he knew that if things got physical, Rude would handle it. That is not bravery. That is using someone else as a weapon. And Savage was very good at it. When the police arrived, they brought a dog, a German Shepherd. The dog bit Savage, and Savage kept fighting. He later joked that the dog snapped into a Slim Jim. That is classic Savage. Turning violence into a catchphrase, turning trauma into marketing. But the real story is not about Savage fighting a dog. It is about why he felt safe starting a fight in the first place. He felt safe because Rude was his backup. Rude was the force multiplier. And by putting Rude on his list of toughest men, Savage was admitting something. He could not have handled that situation alone. He needed muscle. He needed protection. He needed Rick Rude. And that need shaped their entire relationship. The distinction between Haku and Rude is subtle but important. Haku was feared for what he could do, the potential violence he represented. Rude was respected for what he did do, the actual violence he delivered. Rude had a background that bridged the gap gap between a legitimate wrestler and a brawler. His grip strength allowed him to dictate the physical terms of any encounter. There are stories of Rude shaking hands with people and crushing their fingers without even trying. That kind of functional strength is terrifying because it means in a grappling situation, Rude could control you. He could hurt you. He could end the fight before it really started. And Savage recognized that value. Savage trusted Rude in a way he trusted almost no one. Savage's paranoia about his wife, Miss Elizabeth, was extreme. He allowed almost no one into his inner circle, but Rude was permitted to travel with them. That is the highest form of validation Savage could offer. It meant he trusted Rude not just to protect him, but to protect Elizabeth. And for a man as jealous and paranoid as Savage, that trust was everything. Savage believed everyone wanted Elizabeth. He believed other wrestlers were trying to get close to her. He believed people were plotting behind his back, but he did not believe that about Rude. Rude was loyal. Rude was professional. Rude understood boundaries, and that made him indispensable. Rude also worked stiff in the ring. He hit hard. For Savage, this was desirable. It made the match look real. Wrestling in that era was about creating the illusion of violence. But Savage wanted more than illusion. He wanted reality mixed with illusion. He wanted matches that hurt, that left bruises, that left scars, because that was the only way to prove it was real. And Rude delivered that. He did not pull his punches. He did not soften his strikes. He hit you, and Savage respected that, because it meant Rude treated the business with the same deadly seriousness that Savage did. They were kindred spirits in that way. Both men believed wrestling should hurt. Both men believed you should earn your spot through suffering, and both men were willing to inflict that suffering on others. Savage famously said, "There are no tough guys in wrestling," but he likely viewed Rude as the exception, a man who was tough outside the ring and brought that toughness inside the ring. Rude was not playing a character when he acted tough. He was just being himself, and that authenticity was rare in wrestling. Most guys played tough. Rude was tough, and Savage needed that. He needed someone he could rely on when things got real, someone who would not run, someone who would not hesitate, someone who would do what needed to be done. Rude was that person, but do not mistake their relationship for friendship. Savage did not want mates. He wanted security, and Rude provided that. He was hired muscle with a pretty face, and Savage kept him around because he was useful, not because he was loved. But even bodyguards are not enough when you worship the old ways. Number 3 is Harley Race. Race was the bridge between eras. Before the WWF turned wrestling into a polished television product, the NWA was dominant, and Harley Race was its king. Savage was a second-generation wrestler. His father was Angelo Poffo, and Savage held a deep reverence for the type of toughness Race embodied. This was not just respect, it was ancestral worship. Race represented everything Savage believed wrestling should be: tough, brutal, real. The old territory days were not about entertainment, they were about survival. Promoters carried guns, wrestlers carried knives, riots happened, and you had to be able to fight your way out. Race came from that world, and Savage worshipped it. The most significant finding in the research is the direct role Race played in creating the Macho Man persona. Race stated in an interview that he helped Randy put together that image. That establishes everything. Savage did not just view Race as a peer, he viewed him as an architect. Race built the blueprint for Savage's identity, the costume, the cadence, the intensity. Race helped shape all of it, and that meant Savage owed him, not financially, but spiritually. Savage believed that without Race's guidance, he would not have become the Macho Man, and that debt defined their relationship. Savage was not Race's equal, he was Race's student, and students do not challenge teachers, they obey them. This explains why Savage allowed Race to brutalize him in their matches. Savage was fiercely protective of his spot. He did not sell for just anyone. Selling means making your opponent look good by reacting to their offense, and Savage was selective about who he sold for. He wanted to protect his image. He wanted to look tough. But for Race, he sold with reckless abandon. He took brutal bumps. He made Race look like a killer because he was paying tribute, and that tribute was also submission. Savage needed Race's approval. He needed to know that the old guard accepted him, because without that, he felt like a fraud. He felt like he was playing dress-up, like he was an imposter in a world of real tough guys, and Race was the validator, the one who could tell him he belonged. Race's toughness was built on more than respect. It was built on lore. The most famous piece of lore was his left hand. Race once said that if he punched a man with his left hand and the man did not fall down, he would go look behind him to see what was holding him up. Savage heard this. Everyone in the locker room heard this, and Savage was in the ring with Race. He felt that left hand. He knew it was not a joke. The toughness here was not just brute force, it was technique. Race was a hooker. That meant he was trained in submission holds designed to cripple, legitimate wrestling, the kind that could break bones. Race could stop working and start shooting at any moment, and there would be very little Savage could do to stop him. That knowledge hung over every match they had. Savage knew he was safe only because Race allowed him to be safe, and that power dynamic shaped everything. Two stories validate the legend of Harley Race. The first is the ice block. At a dinner party, when a block of ice needed breaking, Race punched it. He shattered it instantly. Savage may not have been there, but such stories pervaded the locker room. They built the legend, and legends matter in wrestling. They create aura, they create fear, they create respect. The second story is the gun. In the territorial days, promoters and champions carried firearms for protection. Race carried this tradition into the WWF. Savage also carried weapons, often a knife or a cudgel, so he recognized a kindred spirit in Race. They were men who believed they were constantly in enemy territory. That paranoia bonded them, but it also meant Savage saw Race as a necessary validator. If Race accepted him, then Savage was legitimate. If Race rejected him, then Savage was nothing. And that gave Race tremendous power over Savage's psyche. The transition of the King gimmick from Race to Haku, and eventually to Savage as the Macho King, represents a lineage. Savage saw himself as the inheritor. By listing Race as one of his toughest opponents, Savage was validating his own reign. If Race was the toughest of the old era and Savage defeated him, then Savage was the toughest of the new era. But that logic also reveals Savage's insecurity. He needed external validation constantly. He could not just be great. He needed someone else to confirm it. And Race was that confirmation. But the cost was submission. Savage had to bow to the old king to become the new king, and that ate at him because bowing is weakness, and Savage hated weakness, especially in himself. So he bowed to Race publicly while resenting the need to bow privately. And that resentment turned inward. It became self-loathing. It became perfectionism. It became the drive that made Savage great and miserable in equal measure. Race also represented a type of masculinity that Savage aspired to. Race was quiet. He did not brag. He did not need to perform toughness. He just was tough, and people knew it. Savage, on the other hand, was loud. He was flamboyant. He wore bright colors and spoke in a high-pitched rasp, and he worried that people did not take him seriously, that they saw him as a showman rather than a fighter. Race validated him. Race took him seriously, and that meant the world to Savage. Because if Harley Race respected you, then you were real. And being real was the only thing Savage ever wanted. Not fame, not money, not championships. He wanted to be real, and Race gave him that for a price. Then comes the name that proves toughness is not only fists, it is lungs and discipline. Number 2 is Ricky Steamboat. While Haku, Rude, and Race represent physical danger, Steamboat represents a completely different paradigm. Athletic toughness. For Savage, toughness was not only about who could win a fight, it was about who could survive the deep water of a 30-minute classic without faltering. And Steamboat could. The match between Savage and Steamboat at WrestleMania 3 is widely regarded as the greatest match of the 80s. But the toughness Savage identified in Steamboat was not in the match itself. It was in the preparation. It was in what Steamboat endured to get there. And what he endured was Randy Savage's obsessive, controlling, perfectionist madness. Savage was a notorious perfectionist. He scripted his matches move for move. Most wrestlers called matches in the ring. They planned the finish and maybe a few big spots, but the rest they did on the fly. That is the traditional way. But Savage did not trust tradition. He did not trust improvisation. He needed control. So for WrestleMania 3, he outlined approximately 160 specific moves and reversals. Every punch, every kick, every reversal, every near fall, all scripted, all planned, all controlled, and Steamboat had to memorize it. All of it, like an actor memorizing a script. Except actors do not get concussed if they forget their lines. Lanny Poffo clarified Savage's motivation. He said Randy needed Ricky Steamboat to prove he was a legitimate athlete. Savage had a chip on his shoulder. He was seen as a showman, a character, a guy who was good on the microphone but not a real wrestler. And that killed him. Because Savage believed he was a real wrestler, he believed he was one of the best. But belief is not enough. You need validation. And Savage used Steamboat to get it. He wanted to have the greatest match of all time. He wanted critics to say he was not just a talker, he was a worker, and he was willing to torture Steamboat to make it happen. Savage dragged Steamboat through endless rehearsals. He called him at all hours, middle of the night, early morning, whenever Savage felt the need to go over the match again, and he would quiz Steamboat. Step number 14, what is it? Step number 63, what is it? Step number 112, what is it? Over and over, testing him, pushing him, trying to break him, because if Steamboat broke, it would prove Savage was stronger. It would prove Savage was tougher. But Steamboat did not break. break. He endured the psychological badgering. He memorized every move. He executed the match with high-speed precision, and that proved his toughness to Savage. Not his physical toughness, his mental toughness. His ability to deal with Savage's madness without cracking. The research highlights a specific promo where Savage tells Steamboat that his time in the big leagues would be a cup of coffee in the big time. That was a scripted line, but it reflected Savage's real attitude. He was testing Steamboat. He wanted to see if the Dragon had the fortitude to stay at the top level. This was not encouragement. It was psychological warfare. Savage wanted Steamboat to feel pressure, because if Steamboat cracked under pressure, it would validate Savage's superiority. But Steamboat did not crack. He absorbed the pressure, he used it as fuel, and he delivered the performance of his life. And that infuriated Savage as much as it impressed him, because it meant Steamboat was tougher than Savage wanted him to be. The WrestleMania 3 match is famous for its false finishes, near falls. These are moments where a wrestler kicks out of a pin attempt at the last possible second. It creates drama. It makes the audience believe the match could end at any moment. But executing a convincing near fall is exhausting. You have to explode with energy. You have to kick out with force, and then you have to immediately get back up and keep wrestling. To do this 21 times in a match while exhausted requires immense cardiovascular conditioning. Most wrestlers would blow up after 10. They would be visibly exhausted, gasping for air, moving slowly, but Steamboat never blew up. He maintained speed throughout, and that allowed Savage to perform at his absolute limit. Savage respected Steamboat because Steamboat never got tired. He never became visibly exhausted. He never got sloppy. In Savage's eyes, a wrestler who got tired was weak. Tiredness was failure. It was proof you were not good enough. Steamboat was a machine. He had the cardio of a marathon runner combined with the explosiveness of a sprinter. And that combination is rare. It takes years of training, years of discipline, years of sacrifice. Savage saw that. He respected it, but he also used it. Because Steamboat's endurance meant Savage could push himself harder. He could do more near falls. He could go longer. He could create the epic match he envisioned, and Steamboat would keep up. But the cost was paid by Steamboat, not by Savage. Steamboat also took physical punishment. The ring bell throat shot, the rail bumps. These were not gentle spots. They were designed to look brutal, and they were brutal. A ring bell to the throat hurts. A bump on the rail hurts. But Steamboat took them without complaint. He subjugated his ego for the match quality. He accepted Savage's micromanagement without revolt. And that is what Savage respected, not Steamboat's skill, his obedience. Savage needed someone who would let him be in control, who would let him script every move, who would let him call all the shots, and Steamboat did that. But do not mistake this for a sweet story about professionalism. This was Savage using Steamboat to validate his own insecurities. Savage needed to prove he was a real athlete, and he did it by making Steamboat endure his obsessive control. Steamboat's toughness was not in his body, it was in his willingness to be controlled, his willingness to endure Savage's perfectionism, his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for the match. And Savage respected that, but he also exploited it. He pushed Steamboat to the limit. He tested him constantly. He demanded perfection, and when Steamboat delivered it, Savage did not thank him. He moved on to the next test, the next match, the next challenge. Because for Savage, there was never enough validation. There was never enough proof. There was always another mountain to climb, and Steamboat was just the rope he used to climb it. But one man was not about fear or protection or work rate. One man was the war inside Savage's head. Number 1 is Hulk Hogan. If Haku broke bodies and Steamboat tested lungs, Hulk Hogan broke spirits. Savage's inclusion of Hogan is an acknowledgement of political and psychological toughness. Hogan was the immovable object. He was the final boss, and Savage threw himself against Hogan for his entire career. In wrestling, politics refers to the ability to influence promoters, to maintain your position at the top of the card. And Hogan was the master. He held the WWF Championship for 4 years. Savage, despite being the superior in-ring technician, was always positioned as the number 2 star, and that killed him every single day. It ate at him. It consumed him. It became the central obsession of his professional life. Savage's resentment was real. His toughness claim regarding Hogan validates the difficulty of existing in Hogan's orbit. It required unique mental fortitude to work with a man you believe was actively holding you back. The toughness was in not quitting, in not walking away, in staying in the game even when you knew the game was rigged against you. Savage could not control Hogan, Hogan. He could not outshine him. He could not manipulate the office the way Hogan did, and that drove him mad. But he stayed. He kept fighting. And in Savage's twisted logic, that made Hogan tough, because Hogan could survive all of Savage's brilliance and still stay on top. That takes a certain kind of resilience, a certain kind of political savvy, a certain kind of ruthlessness. The animosity between Savage and Hogan was not merely a storyline. It was fueled by Savage's intense jealousy regarding Miss Elizabeth. He believed Hogan was too close to her. He believed Hogan was manipulating them. He believed Hogan wanted to break them apart. Whether any of this was true does not matter. Savage believed it, and belief shapes reality. The research mentions Savage's rap album from 2003, specifically the track Be a Man. In it, Savage challenges Hogan to a legitimate fight. This confirms that Savage viewed Hogan's physical toughness as fraudulent. He thought Hogan was soft, that Hogan was protected, that Hogan hid behind politics and backstage manipulation. But he respected Hogan's ability to survive the challenge. By listing him as a tough opponent, Savage was acknowledging Hogan as the ultimate final boss of his life, the man he could never beat. There are also references to a backstage altercation where Savage allegedly punched Hogan. He gave him a black eye before WrestleMania 9. This flashpoint of violence illustrates the tension. It shows that Savage's anger was not just professional, it was personal, it was visceral. He wanted to hurt Hogan. He wanted to make Hogan feel pain. But Hogan's ability to absorb this, retain his spot, and continue to manipulate the narrative demonstrated a resilience that infuriated Savage. Hogan did not fight back in the traditional sense. He did not punch Savage. He fought back by staying on top, by keeping his political power, by never letting Savage have the spotlight. And that was the deepest cut of all. Savage could hurt Hogan physically, but he could not hurt him professionally. And that is what made Hogan tough in Savage's eyes. Hogan was a psychological leviathan. He knew how to work the office. He knew how to protect his spot. He knew how to make himself indispensable. And that political skill set was a form of toughness that Savage struggled to combat, because Savage's toughness was in the ring, his matches, his promos, his work. But Hogan's toughness was outside the ring, in the meetings, in the conversations, in the handshakes and the smiles and the manipulation. Hogan could make Vince McMahon believe that Hogan was the only star that mattered. And as long as Vince believed that, Savage would always be number two. No matter how good he was, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many classic matches he had, he would always be in Hogan's shadow, and that shadow was suffocating. The most poignant part of this story comes from Lanny Poffo. He confirmed that shortly before Savage's death in 2011, the two men reconciled. They crossed paths at a cardiologist's office, or they communicated shortly after. This reconciliation suggests that Savage finally let go of the paranoia. He recognized that he and Hogan were the last two survivors of a golden age. They were the only two men who truly understood the pressure of the megapowers. They were the only two who knew what it felt like to be at the top. And in that moment, Savage stopped seeing Hogan as the enemy. He saw him as the only other person who understood, the only other person who carried the same burden, the only other person who lived in the same mental cage. But do not romanticize this. The reconciliation does not erase decades of bitterness. It does not erase the jealousy. It does not erase the control issues. It does not erase the resentment. Savage spent his career trying to prove he was better than Hogan, and he failed. Not because he was not talented, but because wrestling was not about talent. It was about politics. It was about who could work the system. It was about who could stay on top. And Hogan was better at that game than Savage. Savage was the better wrestler, the better performer, the better athlete. But Hogan was the better politician. And in wrestling, politics wins. Every time. The cream of the crop promo is often cited for its entertainment value, but it is also a window into Savage's mindset. He declares he is the cream that rises to the top. That was a direct challenge to Hogan's hegemony. Savage was saying that talent wins, that quality wins, that the best wrestler becomes the top star. But he was wrong. Hogan proved him wrong. Day after day, year after year. Hogan stayed on top not because he was the best wrestler, but because he was the best at protecting his spot. And Savage's career was a constant struggle to prove that he, not Hogan, was the rightful king. Savage wanted wrestling to be a meritocracy, but it was not. It was a monarchy, and Hogan was the king. And Savage was the prince who could never inherit the throne. Hogan's toughness was his ability to stay on top despite Savage's relentless brilliance. Despite Savage's better matches, despite Savage's better promos, despite Savage's better work ethic, Hogan stayed on top. And that takes a certain kind of mental toughness. It takes the ability to ignore criticism, to ignore talent, to ignore merit, and to focus only on maintaining power. That is not physical toughness, but it is toughness nonetheless. It is the toughness of the politician, the toughness of the manipulator, the toughness of the survivor. And Savage recognized it. He hated it, but he recognized it. And that is why Hogan is #1 on his list. So what does this list tell us about Randy Savage? It tells us he was paranoid. He felt hunted. He needed protection. He needed validation. He needed a final boss. The 5 men he named were not just tough. They were the architecture of his fears. Haku and Rude were his protectors, the walls of his fortress. Savage knew he was a target. He was smaller than the giants, louder than the stoics, wealthier than the jobbers. He needed men who could frighten the threats away, and he kept them close not out of friendship, but out of necessity. They were not his mates. They were his insurance policy, and he paid the premium by giving them his respect. Steamboat and Race were his validators. Savage needed to know he was real. He used Race to validate his lineage. He used Steamboat to validate his athleticism. They were the mirrors in which he checked his own reflection, and what he saw in those mirrors was never enough. He always needed more proof, more confirmation, more validation, because deep down, he did not believe in himself. He believed in the performance, and he needed others to tell him the performance was good enough, but it never was. No matter how many people told him, no matter how many classic matches he had, no matter how many championships he won, it was never enough, because the validation he needed could not come from outside. It had to come from inside, and inside, Savage was empty. Hogan was his rival, the insurmountable peak, the dragon he could never slay, and the struggle against Hogan defined Savage's ambition, but it also poisoned his life. Because no matter how hard he worked, no matter how brilliant he was, he could never escape Hogan's shadow, and that shadow became his identity. He was not Randy Savage. He was the guy who was almost as big as Hulk Hogan. He was not the Macho Man. He was Hogan's sidekick, his tag team partner, his #2. And that is what made Hogan the toughest in Savage's eyes. Not his body, not his skill, his ability to stay on top, his ability to survive, his ability to outlast Savage's brilliance, his ability to win the war that mattered most, the war for the top spot. Underlying all these choices is Savage's legendary paranoia. He checked his car for bombs. He locked his wife in dressing rooms. He trusted almost no one. He respected Haku because Haku was a truth in a world of lies. Haku did not pretend. He did not perform. He just was. And that authenticity was rare. Savage respected Rude because Rude was loyal in a world of traitors. Rude did not betray him. Rude did not gossip. Rude did not plot. Rude just did his job, and that loyalty was priceless. Savage respected Steamboat because Steamboat was disciplined in a world of chaos. Steamboat showed up. Steamboat worked hard. Steamboat delivered, and that discipline was essential. Savage respected Race because Race was consistent in a world of flux. Race did not change. Race did not compromise. Race was the same tough guy year after year, and that consistency was comforting. Savage respected Hogan because Hogan was the only other man who saw the view from the top of the mountain. Hogan understood the pressure. Hogan understood the loneliness. Hogan understood what it cost to be the top guy. And that shared experience created a bond, even through the hatred, even through the jealousy, even through the rivalry. They were bonded by their shared suffering, and in the end, that bond was stronger than the rivalry. That is what the reconciliation represents. Two old warriors recognizing that they fought the same war, just on different sides. But none of this respect was pure. It was all filtered through fear, through need, through control. Savage did not respect these men because they were good people. He respected them because they were useful. Haku kept him safe. Rude protected him. Race validated him. Steamboat proved him. Hogan challenged him. And together they built the Macho Man, not the character, the man, the paranoid, brilliant, tortured man who could never rest, who could never trust, who could never let go. These 5 names were the architecture of his agony, and they remain the proof that toughness is not about how hard you hit. It is about how much pressure you can carry. And Randy Savage carried more than most, whether he wanted to or not. Savage famously told an interviewer that there are no tough guys in wrestling. That was a lie. His life was defined by tough guys. The Waffle House brawl with Rude, the locker room fear of Haku, the grueling rehearsal with Steamboat, the mentorship of Harley Race, the decades-long psychological war with Hogan. These were not just stories. They were the minefield Savage walked every day. And these 5 men were the mines. They forced him to be careful. They forced him to be vigilant. They forced him to be the Macho Man, because the Macho Man was not a character. It was a defense mechanism. It was the armor Savage wore to survive in a world he believed was trying to destroy him. So when you look at this list, do not see it as a tribute to tough men. See it as a confession. Savage was admitting that he lived in a mental cage of his own making. He was admitting that he needed these men more than they needed him. He was admitting that his entire career was built on fear, fear of being exposed, fear of being hurt, fear of being forgotten. And these 5 men were the ones who kept that fear alive. They were the pressure that shaped him. They were the fire that forged him. But they were also the prison that trapped him. They were the walls he could not escape. And every day, those walls closed closed in a little tighter. Randy Savage was unforgettable. He was intense. He was driven. He set a standard that few have matched. He created moments people still quote decades later. The cream of the crop promo, the WrestleMania 3 match, the Mega Powers, the Macho King. These are not just wrestling memories. They are cultural touchstones. They transcend the business. They became part of the language. But the same intensity that made him iconic also made him impossible to be around. He was controlling. He was paranoid. He was volatile. He was exhausting. And the 5 men on this list were the only ones tough enough to deal with him or survive him or outlast him. They were the ones who could handle the pressure. They were the ones who could match his intensity. They were the ones who could give him what he needed, even when what he needed was toxic. In the end, Savage chose these names because they matched the kind of fear he carried every day. They were not his friends, they were his mirrors. They reflected back everything he was afraid of and everything he needed to be. Haku showed him the truth, that real toughness does not need to perform, it just exists. Rude showed him loyalty, that real protection comes from having someone you can trust to do violence on your behalf. Race showed him legacy, that real validation comes from the old guard accepting you. Steamboat showed him discipline, that real athleticism comes from endless work and sacrifice. Hogan showed him the cost of ambition, that real power comes not from talent but from politics. And together they built the Macho Man, not the character, the man, the paranoid, brilliant, tortured man who could never rest, who could never trust, who could never let go. These 5 names were the architecture of his agony. And they remain the proof that toughness is not about how hard you hit. It is about how much pressure you can carry, how much fear you can live with, how much pain you can endure, how much control you can maintain. And Randy Savage carried more pressure, lived with more fear, endured more pain, and maintained more control than almost anyone in wrestling history. Whether he wanted to or not, whether it made him happy or not, whether it destroyed him or not, he carried it. And these 5 men were the ones who made him carry it. They were the weight on his shoulders, the burden on his back, the cross he bore, and he bore it all the way to the end, until his heart gave out, until the paranoia consumed him, until there was nothing left but the legend, the Macho Man, the cream of the crop, the man who rose to the top, and the 5 tough guys who made sure he never felt safe there.